Afternoon, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to do a little tutorial on painting marble. Usually paint marble for bases or for small dioramas. It can also be done in armor as well, which is a little bit more troublesome but still very doable. Today we're going to focus on painting some cream or honey marble on a couple of different bases. As ever before starting to paint something, I normally like to do a little bit of research, always helps. Google image, as ever, is your friend. So for marble, just typed in cream marble, you get a huge number of different types of marble, which will give an idea of what you're wanting to paint, colors, and also trying to understand what the material is that you're trying to replicate. An easy one to look at, like this, we can see all the different colors that go into marble. We've got all different types of veining, from banded veining, where you've got large blocks of color that kind of stop, and you've got thinner veining as well, which is a faster process when marble is created, which gives you these darker lines which look like cracks, but they're not actually cracks at all. So with this in mind, we can start to pick out some colors that we're going to work with. So for this, we're going to use scale 75. For our darker color, we're going to be using a little Dubai Brown, little Thar Brown for a base, and for our lighter colors, a bit of Birch, and then for any highlights we want to do, old favorite, Nacar. I'll use a couple of things as well, like the Vallejo Glaze Medium for when we're making a slip, and then for some shading as well, good old GW's Agrax and Nulin Oil, and a little bit of Lahmian Medium to thin the washes. If you're wanting to use GW paints, for your darkest, which is going to be the darker banding, little XV88, I would darken it a little bit with a little Rhinox hide thrown in. Works just as well as the Dubai Brown from scale. For a base tone, Talar and Sand, you could go with Zamizi Desert, but I find this is just a little lighter. The Zamizi Desert is going to be a little bit harsh. For your main slip color, Screaming Skull. And then if you want to do any highlights, an off-white like Pallid Witch Flesh. I don't generally go to a pure white, can be a little bit harsh. We're going to look at scale colors today. So we're going to be looking at making a base something like what's up there, which was one I did before using a Screebor Miniatures face. So I got 3 different bases prepped and ready. We've got one which is going to be for the white line from Kingdom Death, again Screebor Miniatures base, and a skull from GW, and Micro Art Studios base, similar to one I've done before, again showing an old marble tiled floor, and then just a scratch built simple rect tile floor and wall. We'll focus on doing the actual tiled floor today. So we've got 3 different textures as well. We've got the more kind of rounded and 3D marble face from a statue, a rough textured tile floor, and then a smooth tile floor. So we're going to focus on doing those 3 bases today. First things first, I went ahead and just primed, very simple prime, 3-part prime, splash of black, then grey, and then a scoosh of white over the top, more really so I can see details than anything else, but also to give some nice strong highlights when it comes to painting marble. I then went ahead and primed with a little primed and based them with some Thar Brown, just gives a nice kind of rich beige undertone, and then after that we went ahead with Birch. So let's get stuck in, and we'll start with a little Thar Brown, just pure Thar Brown. These are scale 75 scale color paint, so they're super matte. I'm going to put a little bit of that just at that. You don't need too much because it needs to be watered down a fair bit. A little scoosh more, no harm, no foul. And I'll throw out some Birch as well. I'm going to put out a lot more Birch. I'm going to keep the Birch separate. I want that over here because we're going to make a slip out of this, and we're going to make quite a lot of it. So let's put a fair bit of that out. Beside my Thar Brown, I then want what's going to be the veining color, the darker veining color, which we're using Dubai Brown for. And I'll keep a little bit of that here. We don't need as much as that. And then finally for my highlights, as we said, a little bit of Nacar. Nacar is a really nice kind of cold off-white We'll come to the washes and that later on. So the first thing I want to do is get this based. I use older brushes. When we're doing kind of bases and stonework and that, which are very textured, I use older janky brushes, as you do get quite rough on them. So we'll start off with our Thar Brown. Thin it down a little bit because the scale paints are quite thick. Just with water. And these initial colours do not have to be perfect, but try and get a nice even coat. We're just going to go for the face, as the dirt and the ground around it will bring me a different colour later on. I built up a lot of gravel and grit around here, so we've got a few larger lumps of rock which may have actually broken off the statue, so I'll cover those just now as well. But we'll be focusing mainly on the base during this tutorial. Some odd wee ferns growing up around the sides. Don't trust ferns, they're untrustworthy because of reasons. Nice big lump of rock there again, so just some pure Thar Brown. Again, if you're using GW, at this point I'd probably use the Easy Desert, maybe lighten it up a little bit. Try not to get any brush strokes in your coat. If you get a couple, it's no real bother because we're going to be putting a lot of layers on over this. For doing marble, it's layers upon layer, and we're going to be using a technique which is ported over, usually associated with doing watercolors, which is wet and wet. We'll come to that in a wee minute. It's another nice lump of rock over there. We'll say that's going to be marble as well. The rest of the grit and the stone around the face I'll do in a different workup at another time. But for now, so just a nice, don't need to do 2 layers, just 1 is fine. It's just to get that kind of base color down. Once that's all done, it'll look a little something like this. We're going to move to a lighter tone, and this is going to be our controlling tone, the main color of the marble. So we have the birch here. First time in, I want to get a nice layer of the birch. So I'm not going to thin it out too much, just to an even layer consistency. And I'm going to overbrush this on. I'm not massively concerned about making sure absolutely everything's perfectly covered. If you leave a little of that Thar Brown showing through, that's totally fine. This is old weathered stone, so it's going to be in so many different colors, from weathering as well as the nature of the stone itself. When you're doing bases, well, it's really up to you, but make sure to get the edges as well. I try and get the edges done at the start, because if I forget, I've got to go back in. A lot of people think marble is one of the really difficult materials to do in miniature painting. Actually, a lot easier once you understand it. You know what you're aiming for and how it should react, and how it should be portrayed. It's a lot easier than people think. A very, very simple technique. Again, I'm just trying to give it a pretty even coat. If I miss a few little dots and splashes in areas, it's not a problem. because we're going to be putting a couple of layers over this afterwards. And let's just get those edges. Just go back and make sure there's no really strong brush strokes. And one coat's really enough for this figure. It's just to get that colour, the main colour for the marble established. Alright, once that's done, put that aside to the dry. Thar Brown is dry already, so we'll give that a little lick. You'll see between the tiled base, the textured tile base, and then the smoother marble face will react slightly differently when we start doing the slips. Again, just trying to make sure it's as smooth and even as possible, but not worrying about it being absolutely perfect. Smooth that out. Lovely. Of course, the light decides to expose the colours because they're so light. Once we're all done, we've got a nice simple base like that. So we'll move on to this. What we're going to do next is we're going to start doing wet, and wet is a technique normally associated with watercolours. When we dampen down, quite heavily dampen down the paper, the watercolour papers, and then while it's still very damp, introduce colour and then move the colour and let it diffuse into the damp paper. Obviously this is not paper and it's not absorbent like watercolour paper is, but we can still kind of adapt the technique to work here and let us get a nice kind of portrayal of those wider open diffused veins in marble. But we need something for our darker colour to diffuse into, so we're going to make what I call a slip. We go back to our birch. I'm going to add a little glaze medium into that. It's a little Vallejo glaze medium. This will get for a nice smooth slip, but it also gives me a little extra drying time. So a couple of drops of our glaze medium. Mix that in. I want that to be much, much thinner. A slip, we're going for a border between the thinnest of layers and into a glaze territory. So I'm going to really thin this down. I'll leave a little bit of thicker up here. But I want this to be really quite thin, because this is just going to be the vehicle to allow our darker colour to diffuse out and get a nice soft effect for the banded veins in the marble. Let's test that out. A little thinner still. Just a tickle more water in there. So we've got this nice slip, and this is going to take the place of the damp paper. It's going to act as our damp paper for our darker colour, which is the Dubai brown, to diffuse into. So if I take our base here, what I want to do is I want to put a layer of this nice thin layer of this slip over our marble base. Don't worry too much about it going into the cracks, and that these cracks are quite, put them on with an awl, so they're quite deep. But we want a nice, thin, even, consistent slip going across the base like that. Add a little bit more. Try to keep it even throughout, even where it goes around the rubble in that. You want to keep it nice and even. Don't let it pool into areas. So while we've got that, I'm going to make that a little bit wetter. This essentially now is our dampened watercolor paper. And into that, I'm not even going to bother washing my brush out. I'm going to pick up a little bit more water in my Dubai Brown. I'm going to thin it down a little bit. I'll get some of this nice darker brown. And you can see that slip is still nice and wet. And while it is, I'm going to start here and start bringing this darker color through. Slowly at first. And pick up a little bit more. No straight lines. And then one edge of it, I'm going to feather that out into the background. We're going to build this up. So let me get some more of the Dubai Brown. I'll have another vein coming out here. It's going into the cracks, don't worry about that, we can feather that out. Keeping a stronger continuous line on one side and then feathering it out at the other. Again, into that slip, so we start to get this, the marble banding. You want to make it a little bit darker at any time, we just go back in with pure Dubai Brown, whichever dark you're using. And again, that slip is all still really nice and wet. And the paint, the darker paint starts to diffuse nicely into the lighter paint. And again. We'll do another bit over here. But again, going in one general direction. And then feather out with a damp brush, just feather out one side. Once you've got that done, I'm gonna let that dry for a bit. Move on to another one. Don't overwork it. Actually, I'm gonna add a little darker one up near the top here. While the slip is still wet. There we go. So I normally do a couple of bases at one time, so I can move between them as one thing is drying, move on to another. So again, onto the face, I'll take some of this slip. Do not let it pool. You just want this almost wet skin floating on top of the surface you're trying to do the marble on. Anywhere it does turn a pool, just soak it back up at the brush. Because of the glaze medium, we've got a little extra dry time, but still need to work with a little vigor. And I'll pick up any pools. Make sure the whole surface. Don't work too vigorously, you get air bubbles forming in the paint. So once you're happy that you've got that nice wet skin across it, pick up your darker color, and again, making sure no straight lines. Go a little darker down here. And then with a clean damp brush to start to feather out just one side of our band into the slip. Once you've done one, start to work a different area. If you spot anywhere where there's pooling happening, which does happen, just soak it back out. So the whole thing is you're going to be building up these layers of our banded veining. Some we will lighten back down, some will add more colour to. Again, we'll let that dry. We've got another one, use a bigger brush, and cover the whole thing in this slip. This one's bigger, so I need to work a little bit quicker on this. When you've got some different objects, this one obviously has got the tiled floor and then it's got a fallen column. Treat them as separate objects. I'm going to do the tiled floor first. I'll come back later on for the column. So obviously I don't want a vein coming right down across the tile floor and then up over the column and then down to the floor again. It's looked thoroughly unnatural. So I'll leave the little bit of the entablature and the column till later on. I'll just focus on the floor for now. I've got that nice slip, just making sure there's no pools, which of course there are a couple. Just soak those up. This is so thin, don't worry about clogging up detail, because we thinned this right down, so when it dries, it won't have done any harm to the detail at all. So again, let's pick up some of our Dubai Brown, and we're going to do a nice vein just travelling right through the base. Snake it through. Add a little more colour here and here. Then my damp brush, I'll start to pull on one side, and we'll go back and reinforce that again later on. Don't mix them, just let it diffuse. Let's pick another area. Let's do a nice big one here, and coming out here. Again, as these paints dry, they will lighten up considerably. So later on we can go back in again and strengthen it. But for now we're just starting to get more our initial groundwork down of where our colours are going to lie. I think a little one over here, just to tickle. So let's go back and see how our first one is doing. Now, these take time to dry because of the glaze medium. So, if you want to hurry along a bit, pop out the hairdryer, give it a bash. So we scoosh of the hairdryer, we've got that nice and down. You see it's lightened up a little bit. If we want to reinforce some of those, we can do now. We're going to have a few more things to do yet, but even though it's dried now, I can take a little of my Dubai Brown. We can go back in. And then just spit feather or void blend that out if you want to make anywhere stronger. But you can see the difference between letting it diffuse in the glaze and by diffusing it with void blending. I prefer the former rather than the latter. Sometimes we do want to go back in and just in a few areas make it a little bit stronger. But we'll come to the thinner high pressure veins in a little while. Now once that's done, next I want to do is I want to add in some patches of lighter worn. I'm going to do that with the dry brush. So I'm going to pick up some of my Nacar and we're going to pound it into the brush. Really, 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 what we're going here for is a powder brush. And we're going to add this lighter color, because remember we still have another slip to add. And I'll add some of these lighter, the Nacar's is cold off-white. So in certain areas I'm going to add in some of this lighter. Doesn't matter if it hits over the veins you've just gone and done. And the idea here is adding in another tone. So I'm just focusing on a couple of areas. Mainly in the middle there, which we got very worn and polished. And around the edges. I'm softening down some of those banded veins because I will go back in. I can go back in and always add them again. Like that. Now again, we're going to give this a little jolly with the hairbrush. With the hair dryer, just to make sure it's dry. Before you start doing the dry brushing, you must make sure that the bases are totally dry. But that one's fine enough, so I'm going to add in again a lighter tone. There's a few wet areas, but we should be okay. So we're just going over the cracks, lighten that down. Be enough. Now once that's all done, we want to start adding in some shadow and darker tones. I want to add a little bit, one more final slip over this, just to calm down the first veins and to reinvigorate them a little bit as well. Then we'll work towards shadowing. So I'm going to pick up some of my slip. This tones down the first one we did. It's very often in marble you have these veins which look like they're almost beneath the surface, barely peeking out. So our first veins that we've put down, I'm almost doing that now with this extra layer of slip, tones those down and makes them look like they're beneath the surface. Once that's, I've got my nice damp surface. Again, we'll do exactly the same thing and introduce our darker tone. I'll follow roughly the patterning I did before. Add a little water into the Dubai brown, but keep it quite pure. As that starts to dry, places I want to add, make it a little stronger down here. At points like this, your resource photographs from Google Image, keep an eye on them, see how the marble travels, how the color diffuses out through the stone. That's good enough. Let's do that with a few other, with the face. Again, I want this one to be a bit stronger, so I'll re-slip. Again, making sure there's no pools, just a thin skin of our slip paint. I want to kind of carry that vein down into the cracks and broken pieces of the face as well, which I didn't do last time. Once I've got that thin skin, it's very strong and aggressive, but once we start to diffuse that back, we get lighter. Just like in watercolors, I can still lift some of the color out of the slip if it looks a little bit too heavy. Okay, making sure there's no pooling happening. My lights absolutely hate that base. You don't have to re-slip the entire thing. For here, I'm quite happy with this down here. Up here, I think needs a little bit more work, so I'll just re-slip this section here and this section here. This is fine. Now, once this is our initial kind of banded veining, I need to add some shadow into this. I'm going to go back in and just see, do I need to define any stronger lines? This is a bit drier now, so it won't diffuse as much. Okay, I'm going to give that a quick dry, and then we'll come back in and start putting in some shadows. Now, once dry, we want to push in some shade. So we're going to use a little mix of Agrax Earthshade for the warm tone. But I'm going to add a little black into it because I want to make it slightly grubby. So I'll just take a little Agrax, pop it out on the palette. A little bit more. And into that I want to add a little Nulin Oil. I don't want it to be pure brown. I want to add in kind of a slightly dirtier tone, because this is old weathered marble. It's been out in the elements, so we add in just a tickle of Nulin Oil. This will be very quite heavy at the minute, so we're going to thin it down. With the GW shades, I don't thin them at water. They can dry in funny ways if you thin them with just pure water. So I'm just adding in some Lahmian Medium, a few drops. Thin down, so we want a very light shade. You can see how light I've made that. And if I test it out on a napkin, just to see the transparency. Nice. So now shades as usual, we want to push this back. This is actually showing shade. It looks like it's going into the grouting of the tiles. That's perfect. Means I don't have to do that, as in pick out each tile, push it back towards the shadows, rubble, what have you. If you get any massive pooling at this stage in coffee marks or tide marks, it's not the end of the world, because they will blend in with the pattern of the marble. But again, as usual, it's just good practice to try and make sure you don't get pooling. That's deepened down our marble, and in its own right it will add in some more depth. So I'm going to go in now and start focusing this darker tone. And I want to go around and hit all my edges as well. The wall itself is going to be done as a kind of a more white plaster wall. But we won't be doing that in this tutorial today. We'll be finishing these off on stream over on Twitch. And where did that big drop go? So this wash will also bring the base color of the marble and the bands together. And it gives a darker, as well as going into all my cracks. Okay, let's do that on our face. Is all nice and dry now, so we can do the same thing. Go on nice and heavy, and then pull it back towards the recesses and soak up any excess you got. Already you can see how well it pools, especially on the face. So I just go back in and soak that up with the brush. Keep it a little darker in here, but still no pools. Okay, last one. Again, the columns I'll come back and do separately later on because they'll have separate veins going in a different direction to the floor, as they're just fallen masonry. Now, once these are dry, there's a few things we've left to do. We've done in the diffused veins, and we've done some darker shadow tones. We have a few other things we want to do. We want to put in some highlights onto the marble tiles, and then we want to do the thinner, more crack-like veining, and then actually some proper cracks as well, as this has all been weathered marble. So once again, we need to dry these out thoroughly before we move on to the next level. Now, once those are as dry as you can make them, I don't normally use the hairdryer, just go away and make a cup of coffee, but for now, I want to add in some light tones back here again. We're going to do exactly the same thing again. So we're building up layer upon layer, as marble is. So are we doing it by building up layer upon layer. So again, just using the Nacar, not pure white. Pure white can be a little bit too much at this point. I'm going to add a little bit of pure white onto my palette though, just using Schmincke's Primacryl, the titanium white, just a little bit, which I'll use for some edges as some of the tiles pop out more than others, but not for what we're doing at this point. So again, get a nice light dry brush, and we're going to go even smoother and softer this time, just hitting some of the lighter areas, which are in the middle, and building it up, not doing it all at once, just let it build up. So you can see we're starting to get some lighter marble in the middle. I made this dry brush as light and dry as possible because I don't want any sort of texturing to happen. So we pound out as much of the paint as possible. We get what's almost called a powder brush of the colour. It's built up nicely. Let's get some on the face as well. The face has got more raised areas, so we want to kind of focus on the nose, the bridge of the nose that's left, the cheekbone. Now, if we do want to get some strong edge highlights, mostly on the face, then on the tiled floors, take a little Nacar and mix in some Primacryl, the titanium white, and we can start to just pick a few edges where the stone is broken, where the light's catching off the edge of the stone. So wherever these cracked edges of stone, we want to add a little highlight just to show the light glancing off them. Marble reflects light beautifully. I want to highlight that cheek a little bit. So I'm going to put a little highlight just in the middle and then just blend it out, softly feather that out. Now at this point you could quite happily leave that alone and just call it done. But we're going to add a couple more little things into it. On the flat surface like this, there's not as much that I want to add a highlight to, except I'm going to run a little highlight where we actually have proper cracks rather than veins. Now, to do the tighter veins that we see on marble, which are formed much quicker, so they're thinner. They almost look like they're actually cracks within the stone, but they're actually not. I'm going to take a little Agrax Earthshade and mix it in with some Dubai Brown. I want to darken it slightly, so rather than using black, I'm just using the darkness of the Nulin Oil. Darken it down a little bit. I want to bring it up back to a warmer tone. Just add a little more Dubai Brown in until I get a nice thin tone. And using a fine brush, we're going to put in some of these thinner, darker veins we get. So I'm going to start with where the banded vein meets the cream, and we'll put one running along there. As thin as you can. Do not want big, fat, wet veins at this stage. Keep them as thin as possible to maximize on that illusion of marbling. I thin it down and make it as light as possible, and normally just go back in a second time, but not every single line. So you go in, do your full line, then go back in again and just darken certain areas. I'm going to bring some of this veining down across the more open and clean looking parts of the marble. Again, always running in the same direction. And ignore the cracks for the minute. The cracks we'll come back to later on. The thinner you can make these lines, the more delicate and realistic your marble will look. If they're big fat watery lines, you'll lose a little something of the illusion. Try to make them as thin and as delicate as possible. And where two veins meet, it's always a little darker. So go back in and just redo. lights really hate that base. Don't overdo it too much, but again, keep an eye on whatever resource material you're looking at, because something from the natural ore will always guide you better. And just darkening some, but not all. Once you're happy with your marble, leave it at that. Now for the veins, I can call the veins done. For the actual cracks, I'm going to get some Nulin Oil, pure Nulin Oil this time. A little bit like that. Take a little water. We want the cracks to be darker so they stand differently. So wherever I can see that I have got some cracks which I'd incised in with an awl when I made the base, I just go back in and line them. Our cracks will have a darker nature than our marble veining. And once the cracks are then darkened, you can go in with some lighter colour and highlight one side of them just to make them stand out more. And that essentially is our marble workup. Sorry about the exposure of the lights on the white paint, but it decided not to like us today. Different textures will take the paint differently. On the this very textured tile base, the paint kind of diffuses out a little more roughly, whereas on the smooth plastic hard tile, you get a much smoother diffusion. And then of course when you do it on a face, it wants to diffuse into recesses and into the deeper areas. That's about it. We will be finishing these bases up on my stream over on Twitch. So if you want to see how these end up turning out, where we're doing the skulls, the base, walls, and all the foliage and leaves and the cracked earth, we'll be finishing them up over my stream on Twitch. And apart from that, I hope you enjoyed watching, and if you find it useful, please do click the subscribe and click the bell as well for the next tutorial that will be coming along. Cheers, take care.